This is episode 291 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drengmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, we are past the signing period now when it comes to the governor and the bills that will be going into law or not going into law or line item vetoed, as the governor made some waves this week. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about more on COVID-19. But the first thing out of the chute I wanted to discuss is kind of a roundup post I made over at Heirs of Enchantment, some articles that I'd been looking at and getting ready to post, just never found the time during the session. Combined them into there's no free lunch when it comes to energy. And, of course, New Mexico, we have a lot of energy. We talk about energy a lot. I think we've talked about the legislature and the Democrats and Governor Lujan Grisham's efforts to try to placate the environmental base without doing anything stupid to totally destroy New Mexico's oil and gas industry and therefore its economy. But, if you're serious about global warming, climate change, CO2, you got to talk about China. And the New York Times, of all news outlets, finally talked about the elephant in the room recently.
Let's cancel the New York Times, Paul. They can't be telling the truth like that.
Well, they rarely do.
They rarely do. No, I read that article, and it's like it's about time. It's like that's always, the United States, a couple decades ago, before China really experienced such tremendous economic growth, the U.S. was the problem. It really was. If you are a believer in carbon dioxide doing all the proverbial bad things, but now it's China and to a lesser extent India, and it doesn't matter what the good old U.S. of A. does if China doesn't take care of business and take a different approach when it comes to carbon dioxide.
Yeah, let alone New Mexico, of course, because
yes,
we're talking two tracks here. One is Biden and his administration with the electric vehicles nationally, with the, of course, moratorium on permitting on federal lands, which is disproportionately hurting New Mexico. Policies coming from the legislature. New Mexico, a little over 2 million people. I believe the U.S. population's on the order of 335 million. I want to say China's on the order of close to 2 billion people at this point. And the New York Times article, it's linked at heirsofenchantment.com in our post. I think the most salient quote I gleaned from that particular article was that China's annual carbon dioxide emissions are 28% of the global total. That is roughly the same as the next three biggest emitters combined, those being the United States, the European Union, and India. So we're not talking about even three countries. We're talking about the U.S., all of Western Europe, essentially, minus Brexit.
Yes, minus Britain.
And India, as you mentioned. That is really incredible. And I know China has a lot of people, and I don't begrudge them the ability to develop their economy. But with the amount of coal and every other form of energy being generated over there in China, what we do in the United States is simply not going to be enough, period, end of story.
Yeah, without a doubt. And then the other issue is a recent story I read coming out of Germany, which is German industry is getting more and more concerned about the high energy prices, making their industries like making automobiles, whether they're electric automobiles or not, inefficient, as well as reliability issues. And so, yeah, A few years ago, people could point to California as being an anomaly. Well, those crazy Californians. Well, now we've seen what happens in Texas from a reliability point of view when we go blindly charging off into some things that, pardon my French, are not necessarily based on data and science and engineering, to throw a third term in there, which is probably the most important. And so, yes, we are heading down a dangerous path as a country, with no guarantee that it's going to make any difference to anyone, except maybe possibly hurting our citizens.
Yeah, and alongside that post, I posted a Reuters piece recently. They had an article, "To Go Electric, America Needs More Mines. Can it build them?" Biden is...
Or will they build them?
Right, will they is
Yeah,
the real operative word. But Biden wants to do a lot of this new green stuff with American-made and built vehicles and components. Of course, the inputs for all of those are critical, and the United States, including right here in New Mexico, has a real opportunity if you are willing to do the permitting and allow the mining to take place. But you want to talk about there may be no more difficult task in public policy than getting a brand new mine permitted anywhere in the United States. And that goes for New Mexico doubly.
Yeah, absolutely. He's since retired, but I have an uncle who was working on permitting a new mine that was to the north of the Chino mine there, the copper mine in Silver City. And it's part of the same operation, but it was definitely a new mine. And he worked on that thing for like 20 years. That was a 20-year project to get that done. And so, yes, if we need rare earth minerals, and we need copper, and we need all kinds of other metals to have it happen, at the rate things go right now in the United States, they're probably not coming from here. They're probably coming from Asia, Central and South America, Africa, and that creates a whole other host of problems from a environmental point of view, as well as from a supply chain point of view, where people are like, well, why make them in America? Why don't we make them a little closer to where the supply of those comes?
And as a quick aside, we are very interested in mining in addition to oil and gas and other important industries in New Mexico. I have tried to find someone from either the state or the federal mining associations, trade associations, to come on this podcast, to no avail. It's an important industry, not a popular industry, but I think they would be in a better place if they more assertively fought to assert their point of view and explain essentially Western civilization, humanity, relies on a lot of the products that come out of the ground. You really can't live the lifestyle that we're all used to, from everything to our iPhones to laundry detergents and many other products that really important coming out of the ground. And yeah, it's not pretty. No one ever confused, and I've driven by the Chino mine down there in Silver City.
It is actually beautiful now, but that is one tremendous hole. You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's just a huge, almost unfathomable amount of earth that's been moved over the decades and getting into the centuries now. And then, Paul, you talked about the basis of civilization. Let's just talk about an automobile, and let's talk about the greenest automobile we could possibly think of. It's not, but what comes to mind? The Tesla. That's the battery. So batteries require mining, and then the body itself requires either mining or oil and gas. So you're either going to make it out of plastic or you're going to make it out of metal. And so there is no free lunch in anything relative to a modern economy. But it's interesting how policy-wise we sometimes act like it is, and then have what turns out to be a surprise to some people. Oh my goodness, we didn't expect this was going to happen. Well, that's just maybe because you weren't thinking a step or two ahead, but we have a lot of challenges. And if we're going to use wind and solar, we're going to need batteries, so we're going to need mining. If we're going to get away from internal combustion, we need lots of things, and it's going to be a real challenge to the economy of the United States. Meanwhile, what's China do? As you said, they build coal plants.
Yep.
They're not the clean coal plants like the ones that operate in the United States that have mercury and nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide scrubbers to take those pollutants off, mercury, take those off. They just put it in the atmosphere. So it's a very, very contrasting situation.
Yeah, and lithium is one of those minerals. It's classified, I believe, as a rare earth mineral. Speaking of China, Wired magazine has a great piece called "The Spiraling Environmental Cost of Our Lithium Battery Addiction," and it goes through all the real problems with lithium mining. And lithium is an important mineral. It's in our laptop computers as well as those iPhones and other things. And they don't have the standards in countries like China or Russia or Bolivia that we have in the United States. But a lot of environmentalism these days seems to be more out of sight, out of mind than it does to be actually addressing issues on a holistic basis across the globe. And that latter is a very challenging thing to do, but you're not actually solving the problem if you just shift it to lower regulated, far away foreign countries.
Yes, and from an environmental point of view, with mining, not that it's a good argument, but it's like, okay, if this country wants to have all this mining and create the environmental issues that it does, then that's their problem, not ours in the U.S. It's very tough to make that argument when it comes to the atmosphere, particularly if you're concerned with something about like the level of carbon dioxide. So the atmosphere certainly is dynamic. It changes. It goes across. It goes across the world. When there's a sandstorm in the Sahara Desert of Africa, the Caribbean gets a dust storm. So I mean, the atmosphere is connected, and the issue of what the climate is, if and how much carbon dioxide impacts, certainly is a worldwide issue.
All right. Well, good points there, and it's easy for people to get caught up in what's happening in New Mexico or in Washington D.C. and not think about these things. And we wanted to highlight that. Also, a global problem, a pandemic, of course, COVID-19, which is receding as vaccines take hold. You got your first dose, right?
Yes, I got my first dose. My arm was mildly sore for a day, and I felt a little weird the first night. So the second dose coming up here in a couple of weeks.
Which one?
The Pfizer.
Okay.
Yep. Pfizer, left arm. And, amongst many of the people that I've been in contact with who've had it, it seems like you're more likely to have more side effects with the second dose than the first. That's the anecdotal evidence. I've read articles to that. But like I say, feeling a little weird for a few hours the night I got it. That was about it. A little bit of soreness. And actually, a small percentage of the side effects that I normally feel from getting a regular influenza or flu vaccine.
But as that vaccine does spread around and get spread to more and more people, and seemingly the COVID-19 problem recedes in our state and in our country, there's been some upticks in some parts of the nation, but overall, New Mexico and recently reopened Texas are doing pretty darn well. Michigan, maybe not as well, but right here, the governor released her latest rules or updates for the yellow, red, green, and turquoise rubric. Alas, Bernalillo County remains in the yellow. Most of the state is moving in the right direction into turquoise or green. I think the majority of the counties are now in turquoise, but most of the population centers outside of Santa Fe County are still in the yellow. So while numerically more counties are moving into greater freedom, the majority of people are still living, I believe it's something on the order of 60+% are still in yellow, including right here in Bernalillo County, but also Sandoval County. And interestingly enough, San Juan County had been in turquoise, moved backward into the yellow level. And that's just one of the biggest flaws of this whole thing, which I think is inherently flawed from the beginning. Donnie is in yellow as well. But moving backward is really difficult for businesses to reopen, shut down. It's not like an easy prospect. You just, whatever food, whatever people you had brought on board, now you have to close back down. It really, there should be a different way for the governor to do this. I think it's an indicator clearly that she doesn't have any business experience when she has policies in place like this.
Yeah, and a few points along those lines, Paul, is one that New Mexico, our rate per 100,000 that we have to get over things tends to be about a third. So, the number of cases is like a third of what it could be in other states until they get to that point. The other thing is we look at the state, and your point is that the population is predominantly in yellow. Well, think about it. Can you be hospitalized in Hatch, New Mexico, or Daddle, for that matter? And so as we see what's going on with things going forward, I do have a feeling that the urban areas and the areas that are regional centers, and you named one, the Farmington region, they definitely are a regional healthcare hub. Las Cruces, Albuquerque, I think maybe we're getting penalized for something. But as you know, it's not that easy to get the data that's used to know that, do they even know? So if I drive from a rural area to Albuquerque and I go to the hospital, am I a Bernalillo County case? I don't know that. And I'm not sure I've seen that question asked very clearly, much less answered.
Yeah, and when you're getting down to fewer and fewer people believing they've been exposed to the virus, that they have been vaccinated, et cetera, that drives the numerator, the denominator lower.
Yeah.
So
on the testing side,
your positivity rate's going to be lower, and it really is high time to reconsider the entire situation in terms of the turquoise, red, yellow, green. I think there's been hints of that. Even David Scrace, the governor's health advisor, seemed to allude to that. Now, on the flip side, California says that they are essentially going to reopen their economy in June. Now, whether that happens or not, I have no way of knowing, but California is right there with New Mexico in terms of being locked down. It would be great if New Mexico would come up with a plan. The governor and Scrace would sit down and say, here's where we're going to completely reopen. We're going to get rid of the masks. We're going to get rid of all these other rules and regulations, whether they've been effective or not, most of which I think has been pretty ineffective. But there needs to be a path to actual freedom, not just turquoise. Even turquoise is not true freedom, especially with the mask mandate in place, which is of very questionable effectiveness.
And there are business categories that still do not open under turquoise. So, at some point, there have been lawsuits filed in New Mexico and around the country. Some of them have been effective, none of the ones here. But at some point, you have to say, at what point really are you taking away private property by your government policy, lacking, lacking the reason to do it. And so I think we could be approaching that. The other thing about California is their governor politically is really suffering because of his COVID policies. There's a recall election afoot, and I think that he saw the writing on the wall that he needed to get out in front of that, or otherwise that effort was going to even gain more steam. We really haven't seen very much of that in New Mexico, is my perception. Maybe I've missed it, but I certainly do read news paper online, check things out, drive around, and I haven't seen very much of a kind of public protest, absent a few small events here and there, in terms of how the governor's dealing with this.
Yeah, well, of course, you have a path forward in California for all of their many political challenges and flaws. They have the recall available as for governors. We saw that happen back when Gray Davis was governor, and then Arnold, the governor, came in. Wasn't necessarily a conservative win in the long term, but of course, Gray Davis got into hot water for rolling blackouts and Enron, the whole 9 yards. So we'll see if this recall election can be successful. If you can have it in California succeed, you got to think that that'll scare a lot of governors into doing a little bit differently.
Oh yeah, and that isn't it interesting, Paul? Just to tie the first two major topics of today's episode of the podcast together, is you have unreliability and high cost of energy and COVID in California all kind of coming full circle. And yeah, these are important issues that people can be asleep at the wheel for a long period of time. But if the price goes high enough and the reliability goes low enough, it's certainly nothing that the typical resident of New Mexico or of the country can ignore.
Yeah, and relating to COVID is the schools. Of course, we are the first week in here. Schools went back a week ago, Monday, April the 5th. Now we're on the 12th as we record this. And my contacts, because my kids are still doing the homeschool thing, folks I know who are involved in the public schools are saying that the schools are very empty, that maybe half the kids in a lot of classrooms are back, which is no surprise. I'm sure you have people like me who have basically checked out of the government school situation. In our case, maybe not permanently. We're not going back to the traditional schools. We're looking at new options for next fall. You have some people who, for whatever reason, maybe their kid's in a groove, enjoys the technological, virtual school thing, or they're still freaked out about COVID. They're not going back to school. Maybe kids are in private schools or some other options. So I've heard that, generally speaking, the classrooms around Albuquerque, at least, are half open or less. Maybe there's schools that have been back for longer that people feel like they're more willing to send their kids back to, or keep their kids back in school. But that's the gist of what I hear about APS. It'll be interesting to see next fall. I mean, 6 weeks, getting your child back into some sense of normalcy at this late date, although teachers are still having to do the virtual as well as in-person teaching at the same time, which is incredibly challenging.
Yeah, that can be the worst of both worlds,
Right.
actually, right?
Right. So there's a lot of challenges still in place. Of course, we're hoping at the Rio Grande Foundation that we go back fully in person. Ideally, no masks on when schools go back this fall. Whether the kids are vaccinated at all or not, that's still an open question because the vaccines are so far not approved for young people. But if the teachers are vaccinated, and that's the other thing, everybody who has the vaccine should just be able to wear a mask, not wear a mask wherever they go, inside, outside, all but low space.
And I would accept two vaccinations from the Pfizer or Moderna, and 2 weeks after your second dose, Totally agree. That's the furthest I can go and say you should have a mask. And another point, not to give away too much of the future, but we this is the third podcast that we recorded today, although they'll be released out over time. But a great point was made on another podcast about have the teachers' unions overplayed their hand relative to in-person learning to the point where they may have damaged the number of teachers that are going to be needed and necessary in the public school system in big ways in coming years? These are very interesting issues, as not as much in New Mexico, although we do okay on the charter school movement. New Mexico's made decent progress, but overall, will we see some sort of a sea change in the next 2 or 3 years that was all started because the teachers union public schools didn't want to teach in person when the private and other schools were able to do so and do so effectively and, as it turns out, safely.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. In the short term, the schools will have more money per student than ever to spend right here in New Mexico, because when you send your child to a private school of any kind or homeschool them, that's money that would be allocated to that individual student, that and hiring the teachers and everything that goes along with that they'll no longer have to purchase. But of course, politically, hopefully, more Americans, more New Mexicans will say to themselves, why am I paying taxes for a school system that doesn't benefit my child in any way, shape, or form? Because it's just not set up the way that it needs to be in order to get the job done, whatever that may be. Ultimately, as with so many things, the politics have to ultimately be the tool of holding people accountable. Just pulling your child out of the school system, whether it's homeschool or a private school, actually doesn't have real negative impacts unless you have that at the ballot box where people say, I'm sick of spending all this money. I want some options.
Yeah, a lot of times, as you say, to follow along, you're just getting the privilege of paying twice, paying for the opportunity for public school education, which you elected out of, and then having to go into another system.
Yeah. Briefly, the governor's time period to sign bills has been completed. Nothing really shocking except one we're going to talk about in a second, but she signed HB 177. It's basically a food freedom bill to allow people to make non-perishable food items in their homes and then sell those without the requirement of a commercial kitchen or a bunch of permitting. That was a bill that we worked on with the Institute for Justice. Another bill that was recently passed, of course, in the special session was the marijuana legalization bill. Not a surprise. The governor really wanted that bad. That just got signed. She signed the budget, but there is a controversy in that one over the handling of federal dollars that are flowing through New Mexico's state budget into the unemployment insurance program, potentially, or not. The legislature said some $600 million coming out of Washington should be allocated to shoring up the unemployment insurance program. The governor saw fit to veto that. Now, the question I have, and I'm not sure if we at all know the answer to this, is she just trying to stake out turf as the executive of our state and say, I get to spend this money that flows in here from Washington, not the legislature? Or does she have different plans for those dollars? Because if she does divert them away from unemployment insurance, of course, we've talked about how elevated New Mexico's unemployment situation is. It caused problems coming out of the Martinez administration, or early in the Martinez administration, coming out of the 2008, 2009 economic downturn. It'll be interesting to see what ultimately happens with unemployment benefits in our state, and if the governor does divert those funds elsewhere, we could really see a challenging situation for a lot of businesses that are then going to have to increase their payments into the unemployment insurance fund.
Yeah, and you nailed it. I think that the reason that New Mexico had the basic lost decade recovering from the 2007, 8, 9, all the issues that happened there, a huge one was the unemployment insurance and how dramatically that went up. And what you saw was businesses that laid off people got hit so hard, they said, I will never make that mistake again. And so they just didn't hire people back. They went to subcontractors, did things differently. Yeah, I think that's a huge issue. Now, having said that, in the short term, Paul, you and I both know how much money there is being thrown at the states from the federal government point of view. I don't think that the overall economy will necessarily suffer in the short term because, believe me, the pump has been primed and they're actually trying to do more. But there will come a time when how many people are employed in New Mexico may be actually highly important to the state as a whole. And believe me, it's going to be important to those people way before the state feels the impact of that. But this is a important issue. And if it is the credit thing, then, that's politics, whatever. Paul, there's another issue, and I don't know if you saw about this, but maybe there wasn't an ability to do that. And so that gave some freedom to state government to not have some of their activities be held to be illegal or inappropriate. Although, as we've seen from money flowing to the states from Washington, it seems like the only rules tend to be there aren't many rules or there are no rules. So I'm not sure how much how likely that is, but a lot of issues there, and it is telling that all that was vetoed and now is back in the governor's office to dictate what happens to those dollars, evidently.
Yeah, and not only do we at the Rio Grande Foundation want the unemployment insurance fund to be solvent as a policy matter, it's pretty simple elementary Constitution 101 stuff that the legislature, whatever Washington or at the state level, that they are the ones that spend the money. They have the purse strings.
Yes.
Now, obviously, here we are with these federal dollars being dumped on us, helicopter money, as they would put it.
Yep.
That tends to remove some of the rules, and obviously in a traditional, normal governmental situation, the people that have to levy the tax, the legislature, ultimately should be the ones to appropriate the funds and spend the money. This is a case where the money is being plowed in here via greater indebtedness out of Washington, D.C., and so the traditional channels are not being used. I suspect that the governor and the legislature will wind up in court over this, and I don't think it's too difficult to say that a reasonable judge hopefully would find that the legislature is correct here. But this is New Mexico, and I don't know. I assume it'll be a New Mexico judge, but whatever happens, it'll be very interesting to see. And there is yet another rift, of course, between the Democratic governor and the Democratic legislature.
Yeah, and if you've ever looked at the New Mexico budget, which I don't know if I'd encourage anyone to do that, in all sum total, it's 3 binders that are nearly a foot thick. A lot of federal dollars come into the state. Those are accounted for in the budget. And so not necessarily that the legislature always has a lot of discretion how that is to the use that's put when it comes in from the feds. But the fact is that nominally, at minimum, they are allocating those funds because of their function as the legislative branch. That's what they do. There isn't a form of government that is highly encouraging, where the chief executive is the one that makes the call in terms of what taxes and spending is. That's just not the form of representative republic or democracy or whatever you call it. There's not a system I'm aware of. You have to go to a way darker form of government to get to that.
Well, we're in a pretty dark form of government here, Wally, especially with This governor who once she said no COVID restrictions, no emergency restrictions will be imposed by this legislature. Of course, she said she would veto it, constitutional amendment. Nothing happened because she essentially said it wasn't going to happen. And the Democrats in the legislature, of course, who run the show, they basically folded up any opposition, any interest in passing those laws. That was the primary thing that we wanted out of this legislative session. But now with the governor, and this isn't the first time she's had this battle with the legislature over who gets to appropriate federal dollars that flow in here. So,
well, yeah, and then I remember way back when, just this last year, where they had to have a special session to actually allocate those dollars, and so we're going to see another special session. As they say, these are all good questions without a lot of good answers that we need to keep an eye on in the coming weeks and months to see what is really going to happen with these dollars.
yeah,
And they're huge, so we're not talking
it's a
small
lot of money.
Yep.
Now, RGF, as we've said, tracked votes in the legislature through our Freedom Index. You can go online to riograndefoundation.org, find the Freedom Index and the results for all legislators, individual legislators. We want to make sure to recognize, well, the best and the worst, and we'll call it recognizing in both circumstances. Because we recognize that New Mexico's legislature has a long way to go before it is the kind of body that actually is a tailwind for our state economically as opposed to being a drag on our state economy. Starting out with the House, because they are where all revenue bills are supposed to start. I believe in Congress, I don't know about federal or state level, but Representative James Strickler of San Juan County led the way overall with 122 points. And these are points, you have points subtracted when you vote for bigger government. You have points added when you vote for less government. So you have a challenge to get a lot of points. 122 points overall. He was the best performer in our index. Stefani Lord, a freshman Republican from the East Mountains of Albuquerque, with 109 points. So a great addition there, a conservative voice in the legislature, in the House. And Representative Randal Pettigrew, he had 108 overall points. And I'm not actually sure what part of New Mexico Randal represents, but I will find out momentarily. He is not here from the Albuquerque area. He is a more rural representative in the GOP and District 61. So he obviously is another new freshman addition to the legislature. Now in the Senate, the top scorer was Senator Cliff Pirtle from the Roswell general area, Chavez County. Senator Mark Moores, who is now running for Congressional District 1, was the second highest performance. Pirtle had 68 points and Moores had 65. Now, this is primarily because the Senate and the House have different voting patterns. The House is much more of the ram it through mindset when it comes to bills. They vote on a lot more pieces of legislation, so people who score at high levels tend to have higher point totals in the House than they do in the Senate. But kudos to all of those folks, Representative Strickler, Lord, and Pettigrew, Senators Pirtle and Moores among the highest performers in the state Senate. Now,
yeah, and I looked it up. Pettigrew is in the extreme southeast corner, so in the Hobbs area, but literally the very far southeast corner of the state.
Well, good for him, and kudos to all of those representatives and senators. Now, in the worst category, Representative Miguel Garcia, who's here in the Albuquerque area, South Valley, I believe, he had negative 189 points. He has not been a favorite of the Rio Grande Foundation for a very long time. The only thing notable about Miguel Garcia, aside from his atrocious voting record year in and year out, is the fact that when he chairs a committee, he makes the very lame joke, be there or be SpongeBob SquarePants, which it really takes humor to a new low. And then in the House, it's no accident that the legislature is where it is, because the next worst performer was Speaker Brian Egolf at negative 187 points. So some real negative voting records there. Melanie Stansbury, who of course is running for CD1, was a very poor performer as well, negative 177. Now in the Senate, Senators Steinborn from Doñana County and Stewart were both at negative 150. Senator Stefanix, whose district goes from Santa Fe to Lincoln County, at negative 146. And Katie Duhigg, who represents part of the North Valley here in Albuquerque and was the former city clerk of Albuquerque, at negative 145. So those are some of the best and the worst in terms of legislative scores. Yeah.
And it is interesting. And from a public policy point of view, don't think that all scores are created equal, because when you're in the majority, like the D's are, and you're passing legislation that is unfriendly to business and to the efficient operation of the state, you actually get things done. Where to take nothing away from Representative Strickler's voting record, but he voted no on a bunch of things that actually go through. So,
True. As did many Republicans. Unfortunately, that's just the function of having not quite super minorities or super majorities among one party or the other. But really, New Mexico is tilted heavily to the left. So an interesting report came out with the Human Services Department publishing a new data book, and it got some publicity in the Albuquerque Journal. And this is kind of the flip side of all the bad policies coming out of Santa Fe. The article is from Saturday, April the 10th. I'm sure it ran on Sunday morning. So in the Sunday Journal, data points bleak picture of New Mexico, Rick Nathanson. And there's a very interesting chart with a bunch of bubbles, and it really illustrates, some of the really negative facts. And not all of these can easily be solved with tweaks to economic policies. I think this requires solving these problems require really re-examining the assumptions that have been made in some of the welfare systems that are really driving, I think, some of the bad outcomes here in New Mexico and other states. Just picking a few, 47.7% of households with children are single-parent households in New Mexico. That is a scary statistic right there. In the United States, which is way too high, 32.5%. That's the national average. Income, per capita personal income in New Mexico is $43,326. The national number is $54,420. And there's poverty rate, 18.2%, second highest in the United States, 12.3% U.S. poverty rate. We have higher than average drug overdose deaths. It's a worthwhile report, and some of it gets pretty wonky. Some of it's not necessarily inherently bad, but definitely nothing is being helped by greater dependency, bigger governments, slower economic growth. All the problems that we face in this state are not being helped by what's happening in Santa Fe or happened in Santa Fe for many years.
yeah, without a doubt. And I was in And this was put out by the state, correct? I did read the summary.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was almost positive that was the case. Kudos to them from an open government point of view to put out a report that, in a lot of ways, kind of takes the New Mexico 48th or 49th in many or most categories and puts it in a single document for analysis. So I don't know. Whoever did that, maybe they're not going to work in government anymore, but it's all right there to see. And like I say, Paul, I did not read the source document, but I did read a lot of coverage on it. And it did have many bleak statistics like the one you highlighted.
Yeah, it says in the article, of course, this is from the Albuquerque Journal, that you can read the full report at hsd.nm.us/2021's data book. So check that out on David Scrace's website there at Human Services Department. All right, Wally. Well, we are going to go ahead and leave it there for now. There's a lot going on still, but as we get beyond the legislative session, we'll have more time now to discuss some of the shenanigans in Washington, D.C., and what's going on with the Biden administration. Of course, we'll be keeping track of the shaping up of the CD1 race, which will happen very quickly, as well as the mayor's race. And we'll try to cover all of those here in the weeks and, depending on the topic, months ahead. So with that, thank you for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.